So today's Ento Live will be looking at the mysterious world of camouflage. So I'd like to welcome Jamie Weir to talk us through his Ento Live, Disguised by Difference. So over to you, Jamie.
Okay, thanks very much for the intro. Well, first off, I thank you everyone for turning up. It's great to see so many people here. And it's also a great pleasure to be part of this series because I think it's a great initiative. So I'm very happy to do my little part towards it. Today, as Karen mentioned, I'm going to be talking about camouflage, and I think if even for people who are just have like a passing acquaintance with natural history, camouflage is one of those subjects that can really spark people's interests and really capture their imagination. And so what I'm going to do today is actually take a slightly different approach to this idea of camouflage, and I hope that will become clear as I go on. First off, I'll give you a little bit of background to myself. So as Karen mentioned, my name's Jamie. I've just finished my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, which was on a slightly different topic, but my specialism, I'm an entomologist and evolutionary biologist. I specialize in Lepidoptera, which is butterflies and moths. It's a group I've been fascinated with, I don't know, for a decade now at least. And so it's great to bring some of that work to you now. The particular work I'm going to present here was actually part of my undergraduate honours project, so the research I did in my final year at Edinburgh. Okay, so let's just dive into it then. So as I kind of alluded to there, camouflage is one of these, it's a ubiquitous phenomenon in the animal kingdom. It's something you can find everywhere. And it ranges from extremely specific, like hyper-realistic representations of a single object in the environment, or just a general resemblance to the sort of colors that you find in the environment. So on the left here, for instance, this copperhead snake. You can see how it matches all the tones and even the textures and the lines in the environment that it exists in. Even a big animal here like a leopard, when it's positioned in this way, you can see how the colors of its coat and the tones, the hues, it all picks up, even down to its eyes. These pick up these things from the environment, and it's quite remarkable to see how well it blends in. It's quite intimidating, actually, that image. You can picture like missing that as you walk along through some savannah somewhere, and then you just turn and there it is. Here's another two slightly more niche examples, maybe. On the left, this is one of my favorite animals, porcelain crabs. So you can find these throughout the UK on the coastline. I actually caught a few of these. I was supervising an undergraduate course a few months ago, and we caught lots and lots of porcelain crabs, and everyone was amazed by them. So they're covered in long hairs, and the hairs tend to attract debris, and algae can grow in the hairs. So they end up looking like really, really convincing replicas of this sandy environment around them. And then on the right, obviously, this is a classic example, a hare, and you can see how it's in its winter coat and it's like perfectly blended in. Well, perfectly blended in except its eye and its nose, which reminds me, this is a point I should have dropped in. There's a very funny cartoon. I can't remember where it's been pinched from, but it was in a lecture that I went to years ago, and someone had a picture of a polar bear camouflaged, and it had its paw over its nose because it has this little black nose, which seems to spoil the rest of the white camouflage. But yeah, so these are two very nice examples. So camouflage, or it's technically called crypsis, is widespread in nature, and it is incredibly diverse. And of course, it extends this idea of resemblance to be disguised, extends well beyond just the visual realm. So you can get a noise mimicking in certain insects. Some insects will mimic other creatures to avoid predation. So you get some flies and things that will buzz like bees and whatnot. And in the group that I work on, Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths, these are no exception to this rule of camouflage being widespread. So this is an example I always like to start with in moths. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. This is the Merveille du jour, which again you can find in the UK. And they're actually in this picture there are three moths. So there are two on the left that are mating, and then one on the right just at the side there. And you can see how the patterning, the colors, the hues of the wings just perfectly pick up the colors and the kind of general impression of these kind of lichen-covered bark surfaces where you often find these moths early in the year. This is another classic one, a buff-tip moth, and it really is quite remarkable how much it resembles a sort of broken, snapped birch twig or something, which is the sort of environment you would find these moths in, a kind of the sort of understory of a woodland, like birchy woodland. Here's another picture of it placed. It's a rule of photography of these moths is you always place them at the end of a twig that's been snapped. And because they, obviously this has been, they don't occur like this naturally always in nature, but you can see it in this picture, it exaggerates the fact that the head end, so the head is actually tucked under the front, and most of this little bump at the front is the thorax, and you can see how it just looks like this severed twig. It's quite remarkable, really. And I've showed people pictures of these moths that I've caught myself, and often it's very difficult to convince them that it actually is a moth in the picture when you place them like this. It's quite remarkable. This is another family now, another group. This is the feathered thorn, and active in the autumn, as you might guess, and it again picks up all the colours and the hues of these autumn leaves. And you can see here how lines also cross the wings. So there's like pattern that extends across one wing to give the whole surface that's visible of the moth becomes like that, the pattern that's exposed. And you see it's all this nice orangey colour, and these lines crisscross it like veins on a leaf to break up the outline. A slightly more specific group of that are camouflaged, or mimics now. This is a marbled orchard tortrix, and it's part of a group that's sometimes called the bird-dropping tortrix moths, because when they sit on the upper surfaces of leaves, and they often resemble to a remarkable degree just bird droppings on the surfaces. So you can see an actual bird dropping on the left and a little tortrix moth there that's conveniently been placed next to it. And just wandering along, especially if you don't have your eye in for these things, it's very, very easy to mistake them for these objects. A slightly more exotic example, so all those species are UK species. This is the caterpillar this time, not the adult, of the giant swallowtail butterfly. And I just threw this in because it's so good as on this theme of resembling bird droppings. I find it remarkable, even the shininess, the consistency. It's so evocative of what it's trying to resemble. It's quite astounding. And so this, I think this is a North American or a Central American species, if I remember correctly. So just to take a step back for a moment and think a little bit more deeply about this idea of crypsis, of camouflage, we have to go right back to basics and think, what is colour? Well, many of you will remember from sort of high school level physics or and that sort of thing, that color is a property given to surfaces by the nature of their interaction with light. So the color that we perceive a surface to be is the wavelengths of light that it reflects rather than the wavelengths that it absorbs, and that's all to do with the physical and the chemical makeup of the material, which wavelengths of light it absorbs and which it reflects. And so the color that we perceive is a sort of a thing created by our minds to process the wavelengths of light. So when we perceive a surface to be a certain color, it's our brain creating a representation of the way that surface interacts with light. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that color is a property of an object, yes, but it's also a property of our own perception and the way that we process the incoming kind of wavelengths of light. And of course, the ability of our kind of visual ability, it can be shaped by evolution and by natural selection based on our needs. So in mammals generally, for instance, they don't have very good vision in the red end of the spectrum, but that's different in primates. Primates have extra cones, I think, in their eyes, so they can pick up on reds much more easily. And there are a couple of different hypotheses about why this might be, but one of the ideas is that it's to enable primates to detect ripening fruit. So there you have the perceptual ability of the environment being molded based on need. So this need to find ripening fruit, and suddenly we get this extra perceptual ability. So camouflage or crypsis, it depends on both the colors of the environment and the visual properties of the organism that we're trying to hide from. So those are two quite distinct things. So to illustrate that, so crypsis is an adaptation to perception as much as it is an adaptation to the environment that an individual finds itself in. So to give you an idea about that, so here, let's imagine we have, this is the environment, this kind of khaki colored background, and we have two species of little moths on it. So you have one that you can just barely see there on the left, species A, that's very well matched to that environment, and then species B that's a completely different color. And this is supposed to represent, like, if we have color vision, so we can see the whole range of color. And in this case, one species is very obvious compared to the other, which is more camouflaged. If we change the way that we perceive this environment, so if we change the image to grayscale, so basically replicating a kind of monochrome vision, so we're only seeing like hues of color, like the intensity of black to white, it looks like this. So it's the same image, just made grayscale, so all you're seeing is like basically the lightness or darkness of the colors. And now both of the moth species that we saw look exactly the same. And they're both kind of quite difficult to spot. So you can see how it's not just about resembling the environment, it's also about if you're trying to camouflage yourself from a particular predator, it's also about trying to adjust and adapt to the visual abilities of that predator. That is key in trying to make sure you're camouflaged. Both of these things work in tandem. So putting that idea to one side for a moment, I want to think about what's sometimes called cryptic polymorphism. So camouflage is, so you can think of it kind of conceptually as the opposite of variation. So when we think of camouflage, we think, right, okay, we're trying to resemble our environment as much as possible. So you can think of evolution like driving a convergence on one optimal color pattern that makes you camouflaged in that environment. And you can think back to some of the species I showed you earlier on, which were like exact replicas of the environment. But if we actually go out into nature, many species seem to be both cryptic and polymorphic, so have many different color morphs or color forms, which is something of a sort of evolutionary contradiction. How can you be both variable and trying to resemble your environment as much as possible? How can something like natural selection maintain and even promote variation in how individuals look when they also rely, it seems, on just camouflage for survival? So these are two contradictory things, seemingly. Yeah, again, so how can selection maintain and promote variation when species seem to rely on camouflage for survival? There's something of a contradiction there. Well, one way that this can happen is if we have a patchy background. So if individuals inhabit an environment that's made up of large patches that are distinct from one another, then in the prey species, the species that's trying to be camouflaged, you can only be camouflaged on one background or the other. So in this case, I have two little fake triangles for representing moth species. And you can see here, if you're a black moth, you're camouflaged on the black surfaces. If you're a white one, you're on the white surfaces. If you were gray, so like halfway between the two, you'd be camouflaged nowhere. So in this case, something like natural selection can drive what's called disruptive selection. So it favors resemblance to one background or the other, but not both. And so you end up with a selection promoting optimal camouflage on one background or the other. And so you can end up with a single species that has several different color morphs depending on the nature of the background. So in this case, we have variation and camouflage because the background that they're trying to resemble is variable. So you have a patchy background, and so the species kind of becomes patchy, so they're matched on certain parts of the background. So that is one way that we can get both camouflage and variation or polymorphism. And this is the case in the kind of classic example that's often mentioned, just certainly taught at high school levels, of the peppered moth. So many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this. So the idea is that pollution in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century caused a sort of darkening in certain environments with soot pollution from industry. And there are generally two forms. It's not quite as simple as this, but this is the basic version. There are two color forms of this species, this kind of speckled form and the dark form. And the dark form is camouflaged on sooty backgrounds, and the speckled form is more camouflaged on natural, unpolluted environments. And the relative proportion of these moths varies depending on the nature of the environment and how polluted it is. Excuse me, I'm just slurping tea. You hear some slurping noises. So that's all very well. But the conundrum is that if we go out into nature and look at species that seem to have only camouflage to aid them in surviving, often what we find is something like this. So you find a species with many, many different color morphs, each of which they sort of grade into one another. They're not terrifically distinct. And these species exist in a background that is relatively homogeneous, and all the different colour morphs kind of bear an approximate resemblance to their environment. But there's no obvious patchiness in the environment that they can match to. So how can we explain this kind of polymorphism and camouflage? Now here's an example of a species like that. This is a bivalve mollusk that you find around the shores of the Mediterranean on sandy and stony beaches. And the image on the left there, taken from the paper that I've cited at the bottom, this is a sample taken from a single 25 centimetre square quadrat on a Greek beach. And you can see just the tremendous amount of variation in such a small area, such a small scale. And the environment of a sandy or a stony beach is relatively sort of homogeneous. There aren't any obvious large-scale distinct patches operating on an environment like that. So this is one example of this phenomenon. Another is this is a North American grasshopper species, Acridium arenosum, and it's a very common in forest floor environments in North America. And you can see they're just a small sample of the diverse range of phenotypes, the color forms that the species exhibits. And again, forest floor environment isn't terrifically patchy, or it's a fairly homogeneous kind of leaf litter environment. So how do we account for this kind of, so we have a sort of a theoretical idea of how we might get polymorphism on the example on the left there, but the one on the right is still kind of elusive. How can we possibly explain that? Well, to take you on a little kind of historical journey through the literature on this, the first kind of tentative steps at a solution were put forward by this man, E.B. Poulton, who's a very prominent late 19th century entomologist, very kind of staunch Darwinian. And he wrote this excellent book, The Colours of Animals, which I'd still recommend today if you can get your hands on a copy. And in that book, he talks in one passage about the caterpillars of the large emerald moth. So you can see them shown there. There are two colour forms of this species, a brown form and a green form, and you find them fairly abundantly in the wild. So Poulton was trying to explain why this polymorphism existed, why there was these two colour morphs in this species. And what he wrote is that one reason might be that the foals of the caterpillars have a wider range of objects for which they may mistake the larvae, and the search must occupy more time for equivalent results than in the case of species which are not dimorphic. So what he's saying is that the caterpillars are variable in coloration and their environment's kind of variable. And so this makes it much more difficult for predators like birds that are hunting for them to try and track them down, because they're trying to look for two things rather than just one thing. So it's I'm sure you'll know this yourself, you know, if you're trying to find things in the house, it's much easier if you just have one thing in mind than if you're trying to find several different things and you're all over the place. So this was a sort of tentative suggestion of why this might be. And of course, this kind of brown-green polymorphism occurs a lot in caterpillars more widely. Now, taking us forward in time a little bit, the next kind of step in this story was made by this German biologist, I think Jakob von Uexkull. And this book that he wrote was very well known in Germany at the time, but it's kind of fallen into it's not as noticed anymore. But his book was mainly concerned with sort of animal perception, kind of animal psychology, and it was very basic stuff at the time, but it was some of the first kind of speculations about these things. And in this book, he recounted the story. I'm going to call this idea the caveat of the carafe. So he recounts a story of visiting a friend's house, and he says that every morning when he came down to breakfast, his friend had a jug of water placed out on the breakfast table. And his friend would do this religiously, and they would eat breakfast every morning. And then on the last day of his trip, he came down and he was seated at the breakfast table, and he's ready to eat. And he looks around and he asks his friend, "Look, could I have some water to drink?" And his friend looks at him blankly and says, "But it's just over there." And then von Uexkull described quite kind of poetically how all of a sudden when he looks at the table again with fresh eyes, suddenly he notices that the water is there, but it's in a glass carafe, it's not in a jug. And he describes how all the kind of fragments of light suddenly pull together, and suddenly he notices, oh, there's the carafe there, there's water there after all. Now his explanation for this was that because he was looking for something else, he was looking for this jug of water that had been there every day, and he was so used to this idea that when he came down and sat down, his mind, like it didn't process the fact that this glass carafe was there, because it was so focused on finding a ceramic jug. And it didn't help that the carafe was glass, which makes it slightly camouflaged and the water's transparent. So it's not terrifically conspicuous. And so he was scanning the table looking for something else, and he just missed the thing that was there right in front of him. And in his book, he just recounts several other kind of similar examples of animals mistaking objects in their environment for other objects. And he gives a couple of very kind of fun examples, like frogs mistaking sticks for worms and so on. Basically, the idea behind this is that just like a computer, that the ability of your brain to process information is limited. And all animals exist in a really complex, information-rich environment. And him sitting at the breakfast table with all these different things in front of him, all the decorations in the room and things, is a visually complex environment. And so your brain applies what's now called selective attention and attentional filtering to try and cope with this overwhelming amount of information that exists in the environment. And von Uexkull actually coined this term search image. So he was saying that his brain was looking for something and that thing wasn't there, and it was so focused on finding one thing. So it was filtering all the visual information coming in from the environment through this search image that it actually missed out on crucial visual information that was there. So that in this case, it was the glass carafe. So he was ignoring that because he was applying this stringent attentional filter to the environment. So that was his idea of a search image, was like a filter through which you process all this information that's coming in from the busy environment. And of course, he didn't phrase it in quite that way because they didn't have the same knowledge about psychology and things that we do. But that was the essence of his idea. So transporting us forward again another 30 years in time, I seem to be making like 30 or 40-year leaps. We're in this is some Dutch pine woodlands with the really prominent, very well-known Luc Tinbergen, who's part of this kind of Tinbergen dynasty of biologists. He's probably the least well-known of the brothers, I would think. But anyway, he was doing some work in around about the 1960s in Dutch pine woodlands, trying to work out the factors that controlled the regulation of insect abundance in these woodlands, and how that related to predation by birds, especially nesting passerines like great tits and blue tits. And he was the next one to make the next leap in this idea of search images. So he focused especially on great tits and predation of three main species. So two moth species, and the adults and the caterpillars, and the larvae of the soft fly of this genus Acantholida, that were very abundant in the woodlands that he was studying. So when he observed the relative abundance of these insects in the environment and the extent to which they were predated by the birds, because he was recording the food that the birds brought back to their nests, he found some really interesting patterns. So there are two different graphs here. Both of them essentially show the same things. The scales are a little bit different. So along the bottom axis of the graphs, you can see the abundance basically of these insects in the environment. So the Bupalis on the left is a moth, and the one on the right is a sawfly. On the left-hand axis, so the up and down axis, is the percentage of the food that the birds bring back that is composed of that insect species. You can see that the solid lines on the graph, or the dashed lines, those represent our expectations based on random chance. So if the birds were just going out into the environment and foraging by chance and bumping into things, that's what we would expect to see them bringing back to their nests. Now, Tinbergen found an interesting pattern. So if you look first on the graph at the left there, you can see that when the insects are at quite low abundance in the environment, each of those black dots, which is how much a single nest brings back to feed their chicks, the dots fall below the lines that we would expect based on random chance. When the insects are very abundant, so at the top end of the scale, you can see that the dots fall above what we would expect based on random chance. And you can see exactly the same thing on the graph on the left. There's a cluster below the random expectation when they're not very abundant, and the cluster falls above random expectation when they are very abundant. So there's like this kind of switching. There's an underrepresentation in the tit's diet of low abundance prey, and an overrepresentation of high abundance prey. So that was one thing that he noted. Second thing was when he looked at the timing of that this switch occurred in terms of how many of these different species the tits were bringing back. He's found again a really interesting pattern. So this graph shows the percentage of the food that the tits are bringing back that is made up of this particular moth species here on the left. and it goes from 0 to 100. So how full the bar is represents how much they're bringing back. And the date is along the bottom. And this is averaged across 4 nests that you can see that the numbers on the right. And so that's the percentage that they're bringing back to feed their chicks. He then compared these numbers to the abundance of those insects in the wild. Now you see the estimates of the insect abundance are a little bit more rudimentary, and they're averaged across days. So you can see the red line there is the average from day 4 to 9, and the blue line is from 10 to 15. And that's the abundance of these Pinolus caterpillars in the environment. And it goes from 0.3 basically to 0.06. And it switches around about day 9, 10. That's when the average starts to decline. Now what Tinbergen noted is, interestingly, you can see that as the caterpillars become abundant, the amount that the birds are bringing back increases steadily. But the thing is that when the caterpillars become less abundant, the amount that the tits are bringing back to their nest remains the same. So it remains really high, even though the caterpillars aren't as abundant anymore. So when we go into the blue line, they're no longer as abundant in the wild because they're at 0.06 as a density, but the birds are still bringing back the same amount of caterpillars. So what Tinbergen noted from this is that a reduction in the abundance of these caterpillars in the environment, that wasn't followed by an immediate reduction in their representation in the diet, which is what we'd expect if they were just going out there randomly foraging by chance and just seeing what they bumped into. We'd expect it to decline as the caterpillars become less common. So that's observation 2 that he made. What Tinbergen did at this stage is a little bit of a kind of conceptual leap. I think he went a little bit beyond what you could probably do reasonably based on the evidence that he had, but I think it was a masterstroke in this story. So he went back to von Uexkull's work. How he bumped into it, I don't know, and re-imported this idea of a search image to try and explain these patterns in the data that he was seeing. And this is, in a kind of nutshell, his idea of the search image and how it explained this data. So he made the point that the visual environment that has to be searched for prey is very complex. So these birds are in a pine woodland, so that's obviously naturally a very visually complex environment. And they're pecking around all these pine needles and branches and whatnot. And so birds have to search this environment for prey. They're faced with this hugely difficult task of trying to find these tiny prey items in this really visually complex environment. So he suggested that as the birds were going about their business, a chance encounter with one prey item leads to them forming what he called a search image, kind of reviving that term from von Uexkull. So basically, they find an insect, they eat it, they think, oh, this is prey, this is what prey looks like, and they learn the visual characteristics of that prey item. They then use that image, that search image, as an attentional filter. So they apply that image to all this complex visual information that's coming into them from the environment outside, and they filter that information through this image to optimize the chances that they will find a prey item that looks like the one that they just ate. So they hunt using that image to increase the efficiency of their foraging in this really complex environment. And he suggested that the productivity of a search image determines whether it would be maintained or whether it be gradually lost. So if they find a prey item and it's actually a very rare prey item, and they're rummaging along trying to find another one, and it's not very effective, oh well, perhaps they'll bump into another one, then they'll learn the image of that prey species, perhaps that one's more abundant, so it's more successful, they find more and more prey, the image becomes reinforced in their mind, so they start to use it more and more. And he concluded that based on this hypothesis, the period in which a search image is being formed or lost, depending if it becomes not effective anymore, that accounts for the time lag that he observed in between the tits bringing back prey that's no longer abundant to their nest and them gradually learning a new search image. So his explanation for the tits continuing to bring back high amounts of prey that was no longer abundant was that they were still hunting to a search image that was no longer effective, and it was taking them a few days to learn, actually, this isn't very effective, perhaps I'll bump into something else and find something else and learn the image of that. So the period during which that image is being reinforced or being lost accounts for a time lag in when the prey that's abundant in the environment or not abundant in the environment becomes represented or not in their diet, depending on which one it is. And of course, the overpredation of common prey or the underpredation of rare prey, that accounts for the selective use by the birds of the most productive search image. So they're selectively using a search image for the prey species that is the most common, and that's allowing them to find those ones more frequently. But it also means that they're more likely to miss rare prey items because they're hunting to this attentional filter. So this again is to resurrect that idea, von Uexkull's idea, the caveat of the carafe. He had a search image, it made it very easy for him to find the ceramic jug, but it meant he missed the glass carafe. So in this case, the birds are overpredating common prey because they're hunting to the image of that prey, but it means that they miss rare prey that they would bump into by chance if they were just hunting based on chance. So I hope that's I hope I've got that idea across fairly well. Now, it was very much, in Tinbergen's mind, this was very much a mechanism that operated between different prey species. So differences in the abundance of different prey species will affect the image that the birds use, and of course that will affect which ones are being overpredated or which ones are being underpredated, depending on how common they are in the environment. The next step in this story was made by Brian Clarke, who was who worked at the University of Edinburgh actually for a while on this topic of colour polymorphism, and he took this idea of between species effects and said, well, really from the point of view of a bird, they don't perceive things as species, they just see things as visually distinct. So if you have visually distinct colour forms within a species, the same mechanisms can surely apply. So he reasoned that if you have a species like this banded snail here, for instance, and it's very abundant in the environment, birds are coming along, they're finding a couple of them, they're learning what they look like, they're searching the environment based on that search image, and they're finding lots of banded snails. If you happen to be a little mutant colour form of the banded snail, so you look slightly different, then you'll benefit from the same underpredation that we saw of rare species just a moment ago. So birds are hunting to the image of the common colour form, but if you happen to be one of these other little colour forms, then you'll be more likely to actually be ignored by the birds because they're hunting to a different search image, which means that they will ignore colour forms that look distinct because they're not looking for that thing. So you know yourself, if you, like I said it before, if you're searching the house for something, it's much easier to find something if you know what you're looking for, but that might blind you because you're so focused on looking for one thing. So Clarke's idea resulted in a kind of selection favouring rare colour forms or colour forms that aren't very abundant in the environment. So novel colour forms will be at a selective advantage because predators aren't using search images of these really rare colour forms, they're hunting common ones, so you're allowed to proliferate and you have a lower chance of predation. Yes, so the use of search images could exert selective pressure to be visually different within a species, just as much as it operates between species, because you have this selective advantage in evading the search image that the predators are using. And this is what we call negative frequency dependent selection, so selection that favours or acts against the common forms and acts in favour of rare forms. So this is, as I said before, this is the flip side of a search image. So using a search image allows you to more easily find the things that you are looking for, but it also makes it more difficult to find things that you aren't looking for because you're processing all this visual information from the environment and forcing it through that filter. So that means you miss other things. So to go back to the title of my talk, difference, when you're using a search image, difference is disguised in the environment. So being different itself is a kind of camouflage. So this gives us a kind of one potential explanation for the kind of polymorphism that I talked about here, so the one on the right. So we have a range of different colour forms, all in a relatively homogeneous environment. And so this kind of negative frequency dependent selection that favours within species variance, if that acts on these kind of populations, then you can see how novel colour forms could arise just because of predators hunting using search images. So this, to break that idea down into a couple of different separate hypotheses. So is this a feasible mechanism to account for the evolution of polymorphism in these cryptic species? Well, to break that down to several different kind of logical clauses. First off, we have the first one, which is that we have to show that predators use search images while foraging. And there's been quite a lot of literature on this topic that seems to suggest it's quite well supported that they do use search images. But there are some problems with that, which I'll return to a little bit later on. The second logical step is that predators hunt using search images, and that exerts the kind of negative frequency dependent selection that I was mentioning on polymorphic prey. So in this particular instance, it's often called apostatic selection. So this is a term coined by Clarke, and it's like selection in favor of rare color forms, basically. And the third step is that this kind of apostatic selection, that actively maintains and evolves polymorphisms in prey populations. Now, surprisingly, so like I said, we have a lot of evidence to support the first step, number one. And actually, there's quite a bit of evidence in the wild that negative frequency dependent selection can maintain polymorphisms in prey species. The weak step is this middle one here, that search image use by predators can result in this kind of selection, and selection is strong enough to drive that apostatic selection and drive the evolution of these polymorphisms. So I'll just give you a little brief summary of some of the really insightful pieces of evidence from the literature on this topic that suggest that it might be feasible. So first off, we have this paper by Alan Bond. So what he did in this paper is fed pigeons seeds that were dyed different colors at varying relative frequencies. And so similar to the graphs I was showing you earlier on, you can see the proportion of the prey that's presented along the bottom and the proportion taken. So this is a one particular color form in a polymorphic population. And what you get is this distinct S-shaped response. So just like the results that Tinbergen got in the wild, you find an underpredation of color morphs that are not very common, and a switching to an overpredation of common color morphs up there at the top. And so you found this just in very simple artificial setup of seeds that were dyed different colors. So there is a point in the middle, interestingly, where they switch and they suddenly become interested in these common color forms. Again, so as I said, we see an overpredation of common forms and an underpredation of rare color forms. I think one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for this idea of apostatic selection, search image use driving polymorphisms in the wild is it was given by Mike Majerus in his excellent book, Melanism, Evolution Action. So in that he discusses some experiments he did on larval polymorphism in the angle shades moth. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this species, very common, very pretty. The adult moths are very pretty. And the caterpillars occur in two different color forms, so brown and green. And you can see, so this is a little bit of a complicated table, but I'm going to talk you through it slowly. So what he did was he bred large numbers of these caterpillars, and he took the two color morphs into the wild, and he scattered them on grassland. And then he came back and recorded how many were eaten by birds, especially starlings. And so, there we go. So he conducted this experiment on 5 consecutive days. And you can see on the first light green column there, he placed out 180 green color morphs and 20 brown color morphs. And he came back and recorded how many were eaten of the green color morph and how many were eaten of the brown color morph. And then he estimated the ratio of rare color forms to common ones that were eaten. And so these were on 5 consecutive days. He's basically repeating the same procedure. And what he found is that at the beginning, the caterpillars were eaten roughly in proportion that they were occurring in the environment. But as the days went on, as he got to day 3, 4, 5, suddenly the birds were switching. So they were no longer eating the really rare color form. And you see that in the ratio here. So by day 3, for every one of the rare ones that's eaten, 69 of the common ones are eaten. So he interpreted this as the birds, over the course of this 5 days, they're learning what the common form is. They're hunting to that search image, and so they're gradually missing the brown color morphs that they were actually spotting at the beginning of the experiment, because of this kind of it's sort of like a perceptual blindness. They're not seeing what's there because they're so focused on optimizing, finding these ones that are most common, the search image that's most productive. And he repeated the same experiment and reversed the color forms that he used. So he put the green ones as rare and he put the brown ones as common, and he found exactly the same results. It's not as striking because he conducted this experiment in grassland, so the brown ones are more conspicuous in a green background, but he still found that the birds biased their search towards the brown ones over time. So I think this is I think one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the literature, anyway, about this hypothesis. So putting all that to one side for a moment, I want to talk to you about how I got involved in this this area of study. So it is, I think, the third year of my undergrad degree at Edinburgh. So I was reading some of this stuff, and I've always been interested in variation in moths and color pattern variation and polymorphism. And I was reading through, some of you will know this man, Bernard Kettlewell, who's a really prominent lepidopterist from the last century. And he was the one who pioneered all this work on peppered moths and industrial melanism. And this excellent book that I really would recommend if you're interested in this topic, or the topic of polymorphism and color variation, The Evolution of Melanism. And he talks about so many different examples. And my attention was picked up by one particular passage where he talks about color polymorphism in British moths that are active in wintertime. So he says that the concept of hunting by visual image, so search images, is fairly well established. Any species which can present an alternative and very different form may gain advantage over monomorphic species. So he's talking about the search image idea that Tinbergen pioneered. And then he says polymorphism is common during the winter months, and he's talking about moths here in the Palearctic. There are, he said, in Britain under a dozen species of Macrolepidoptera which hatch in the 3 coldest months of the year. Yet amongst these are found 3 with polymorphisms, each with at least 3 morphs, and each morph showing considerable variability. So I was reading this, and all the search image stuff was in the back of my mind, and I was thinking, oh, this is perfect. So here you have like a perfect way to frame this hypothesis, a study system in which this idea could really operate. Here's Kettlewell saying, this is very variable. It's probably driven by this kind of search image mechanism that we find. And so it's a perfect little case study to look at this whole idea of search images. Can they actually operate in nature? Can they drive the evolution of these polymorphisms? And so when I looked in literature, it's true, there are about 70 species of British Lepidoptera that are active in the adult stage. These are, I think, Macrolepidoptera just alone between October and April. And of those, about 15 have at least 12 different, distinct, common color forms. So they are an extremely variable group. And the primary defense of these insects against predation seems to be crypsis, so seems to be camouflage. So here we have a perfect example of a phenotypic polymorphism in cryptic species, so a cryptic polymorphism. Exactly the kind of polymorphism that I was talking about earlier on, the one we have most difficulty explaining. We have a cryptic polymorphism. So to give you one example, this is one of the species that is active in the wintertime, dotted border. You can see there the range of different color forms. So it's exactly like I was talking about in my little theoretical example. You have a range of different color forms, all of which are distinct. You could sort of line them up and they blend into one another, but they are visually distinct, but they do at the same time all bear an approximate resemblance to the sort of environment that they find themselves in, a sort of winter in woodland. They all have those tones and hues and patterns. It's another species, the mottled umber, again, very similar, very variable, but at the same time, they're all kind of resembling the same sort of things in the environment. Another one, chestnut moth, same thing, lots of color variation, but they're all kind of natural tones in this kind of woodland environment. But it's important to note that some of the differences between these different color morphs are more than the differences that we would find between some distinct species. So this is a huge amount of variation in these moths. So with all this in mind, going into the final year of my undergrad, I wanted to do some kind of work on this. So actually my honors project for my undergrad degree, I wanted to try and take this case study, so this study system, and try and explore the idea of search images and polymorphism and actually find out, is that a mechanism? Is it a viable mechanism that could explain these kind of cryptic polymorphisms that we see in nature? So the first question I wanted to ask was using an experimental setup. I wanted to say, does apostatic selection, so basically does search image use that leads to overpredation of common color morphs, does that act on natural populations of moths that are active in winter? I say winter moth there. I know some of you are thinking, well, winter moth is an actual species, but I'm using that as a general term just for meaning moths that are active in the wintertime, because that's the group that Kettlewell identified as being particularly polymorphic. So what I did is I invented my own little species of winter active moth. So you can see here, I made these little artificial wing patterns that were based on the mottled umber's wing patterns. I set them out in woodlands, I pinned them to trees, and you can see just poking out onto the bottom there a little mealworm's body that I used as a sort of edible body component for each of these little targets. I made an initial morph, this brown one on the left, that was cryptic, and it was based on the color patterns of the Scots pine tree bark that I used. And then I adjusted the RGB values of the colors so that I had a kind of cluster of color morphs that were all kind of similar position in color space, if you like, but they were all also distinct. So I generated my own little fake, a cryptic polymorphism, a set of little color forms that were all similar, but not exactly the same. And then I went to a local pine woodland. I set these different color morphs out. So I pinned the little moths to trees in populations of 20 individuals. And in each population, I had 2 different color forms. And what I did, similar to the experiment I showed you with the pigeons earlier on, the seeds, I manipulated the relative frequency of each of these 2 different color morphs in these little mini populations that I set up at different sites. And so I left them out for 24 hours. I came back, I recorded the relative number that each color form had been predated. And then I took all the moths in, replaced them with new ones, and ran the experiment again. So what did I find from all this? This is an example from one particular color morph. So the graph is kind of similar to the ones that I showed you earlier on, but slightly different. So along the bottom axis, you can see the abundance, the proportion of that morph, any given color morph in the population. And the axis on the left, the up and down one, that tells you the probability that an individual that belongs to that color morph, the probability that they're going to be predated. Now, the slight complexity about this graph is if the particular color that a morph is, so if it's green or blue or whatever, if that matters, then we expect to see a relationship here. If the color form doesn't matter, then this line should be flat. It should be a totally horizontal line. Because if a bird comes along and it eats 25% of the population, well, the chance that you as an individual will be eaten is 25%, regardless of what color you are. But instead, what we find in this graph is that as the color morph becomes more common, it becomes more likely that birds will eat them. So there is a skew towards common color forms being predated more frequently than we'd expect by chance. And that's what you see with a strong positive relationship, this strong positive slope on the graph. So as a color morph becomes more common in these experiments, the probability that an individual is going to be predated, that increases. And as I mentioned, if the abundance of a color morph had no effect on its likelihood of predation, so that's what we would see if search images weren't being used, if this kind of apostatic selection wasn't operating, then we would expect to see no positive relationship. So this line would be flat. That would be what we'd expect if the birds were just predating based on chance. And actually, I'm sorry, now I think about it, I didn't put any slides in, but when I went back to check in many of these moths, when I took them off, some of them had been pulled off the pins so that the birds could get to the mealworms underneath. Lots of the wings, these little artificial wings that I made out of a paper that were color patterns printed on them, they had little beak marks on them, beak impressions, and I was sometimes able to work out what species it was that was predating them based on the beak impressions. So I'm sorry I didn't put an image of that in actually, but yeah, so it was definitely birds that were eating them. So as I just showed there, as a color form becomes more common, the probability that an individual is going to be predated that belongs to that morph, that increases. And there are several possible explanations for this. This is the subtle complexities of the search image idea. So one idea is that the birds are indeed using search images, and that's biasing their predation towards more common morphs. So they're filtering the environment through this search image of the most common color morph, and that's causing that one to be overpredated. But also, it could simply be a preference for familiar prey, or so what's sometimes called neophobia, so it's a dislike of novel prey, these kinds of things, or a dietary wariness, that's sometimes called. So that could just be the more common morphs are being encountered first, and then the birds are slightly reluctant to take a different color morph, which would be the rare one that you would expect them to encounter less by chance. And there are other explanations that we could possibly account for this this pattern by. So as well as this experiment, what I wanted to do was a different analysis. I wanted to approach the question from a different angle and try and corroborate this idea of search images in particular as the explanation or not, or show that it's not the case. So at this point, I went back to Brian Clarke's work and thought about some of the implications that he discussed of predators using search images. So he talked about the search image operating within a species and the dynamics that we'd expect to see then between different color forms. So he made the point that if a species is rare, it doesn't make sense to form a search image of that species, because going out into the environment, you're not going to find very many of them, so it's not a productive search image. So it only makes sense to form a search image of a common species, and that image is going to be reinforced because it's going to be successful when applied to the environment to filter through all this complex visual information, because we're more likely to find a common species than we are to find a rare one. So he made the point that in that case, we ought to find this kind of apostatic selection, so selection against the most common color form. We're going to find that operating most strongly in common species, because those are the ones that it makes sense to form a search image of anyway. Like if it's a very rare species, it doesn't make sense to form a search image of any of the color forms because they're not going to be very productive. But if you're a common species, those are the ones that are going to be overpredated, and the most common color morphs in that species are going to be overpredated. So what he said that is that, or what he hypothesized is that as a prey species becomes more common, the fact that predators hunt using search images, that will increase the selective pressure in favor of variation. So he concluded that the most common species ought to be the most polymorphic, because they're the ones that are most exposed to this kind of selective pressure against them all being similar, so in favor of variation. And indeed, Kettlewell, talking about these moths, these winter-active moths and polymorphism in them, he made the same point. He said it's among the most common species that we find this incredible amount of polymorphism, this color polymorphism. And so he kind of supported that idea. So what I wanted to do was explicitly test this idea as another way to kind of confirm search images as a potential driver of variation in this system. So I asked a very, very simple question. Is abundance positively correlated with the amount of variation in these British moths that are active in winter? So I went to Rothamsted Research, and who very kindly who sent me a national abundance data for all British moths that are active in winter. I went to some old literature and I looked at the number of named and described color forms for all these different moth species and used that as admittedly an approximate measure, but still I think quite a good one of the degree of polymorphism in those species. So this is going back to 19th century entomologists, and they're scouring through their collections and trying to decide which species deserve lots of different color forms with fancy Latin names. So I used the amount of Latin names that they ascribed to each species' color forms as a measure of how polymorphic that species was. Then I built basically a family tree, a phylogeny of these different species, and then used that for an analysis. And this is what I found. So you can see along the bottom axis the abundance of these different moth species that are active in winter. And on the left-hand axis, the up and down axis, is the number of named color forms that belong to that species. Now you can ignore the different lines for now. The main thing is that there's a really strong positive trend here. So as moths become more, as these moths that are active in wintertime, as they become more common, they become more polymorphic. So there's a significant positive correlation between polymorphism and the abundance of these moths that are active in winter. And so it accounts for about 20% of the variation in the data, which is quite a chunk. So in essence, more common species are more polymorphic, which is exactly what we'd expect if search images being used by predators were driving the evolution of this polymorphism in these groups. So just to tie all that together and give you some closing thoughts. Thinking about just the case study that I worked on about these British moths that are active, these polymorphic British moths that are active in wintertime, I found in the experiment that I conducted that there was a clear bias towards the predation of common morphs in my little fake polymorphic moth population. So it was clear that this was operating in nature, at least theoretically. And then I also found that there was a really strong positive correlation between the abundance of a species and how variable that species was among these British moths that were active in winter. And so both of these independent lines of evidence are consistent with this apostatic selection idea, which is Kettlewell's hypothesis, which is basically that search images being used by birds are driving the evolution of variation in this group of moths. So they're all bearing an approximate resemblance to their environment, but there is an advantage because the predators are hunting them using search images. There's an advantage also in looking different. So there's a tension here. You're trying to be camouflaged, but at the same time, you're trying to avoid predation. So these are the two things that I was talking about at the very, very beginning of the talk. So to be camouflaged is to resemble the environment, but it's also an adaptation to the perception of predators. And where these predators like birds are using search images, then it becomes also advantageous to be different. So you're trying to be camouflaged and you're trying to be different. So it leads to these cryptic polymorphisms where you have many different color morphs and they all approximately resemble the environment. It's like a tension between these two different selective pressures. And so I think that the evidence for these kind of polymorphisms in nature, for this whole mechanism operating, is complex. And as I mentioned, there are sometimes alternative explanations that are difficult to exclude because we're dealing with animal psychology. We have to try and work out what the animals are thinking, how their minds are operating, not just how they interact with the environment. But I think the evidence is generally supportive for this idea. And there is a lot of scope actually for future work, and it's something I hope to work on again myself in the future. My PhD has been on a slightly different subject, so it's fun to always come back and talk about this stuff, and I hope to work on it again in future. And I think one of the most important things is going to be disentangling these conceptually very similar, the conceptually different concepts, but in practice they appear very similar sometimes, or they produce similar results in experiments. I think that's a fertile ground for future work on this topic. Yes, so thank you very much for your attention. If you would like further reading, I wrote a review on this subject, which basically covers the same ground I've been talking about this afternoon, which you can find out. I can send a copy to anyone. Also, this review paper by Alan Bond is absolutely excellent, and I would recommend that to everybody. Yeah, so I absolutely welcome anyone sending emails. I'm very happy to talk about this more through emails. Happy to send copies of my papers, which you can also find on my website. Most of them you can download from PDFs. But always happy to hear from people, always happy to chat to people about this topic. So thank you very much.